Folks, I am once again honored to have the Penn State Agricultural Extension from the Chambersburg office with us, talking through the winter outlook. This is the 2022-2023 winter outlook. We have Casey Yost and Carly Regan. Now, I want to introduce both of these because Casey Yost has been with us for a number of years, providing content for the Hagerstown Almanack, and she is the extension educator in Franklin County. And you can see her contact information there as well. But we are honored to have Casey with us, talking a little bit about the dairy industry and how to protect the calves and heifers as we go throughout the winter season. And Carly Regan is also with us. She's a commercial horticulture educator with Franklin County in Pennsylvania. She's going to talk through some best interest practices as it relates to small vegetables and so forth going through the winter season. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start out with Casey, and she's going to talk a little bit about the calves and heifers, how to protect them in cold weather, what to do in terms of temperature swings, and just a little bit of advice going through the winter season. And also I'll be answering some of her winter outlook questions. I'll go through a specific detailed forecast of the winter outlook for Pennsylvania as well in this presentation. So thank you so much for joining us, Casey.
Thank you, Chad.
So go ahead and let us know a little bit of information as it relates to calves and heifers and how to keep them comfortable throughout the winter season.
So we've done a couple of these winter podcasts looking forward. So it's always interesting to, get the topics of what we want to point out with, but calves and heifers are my specialty. So I just wanted to go along a couple of points here on what to remember as we go along the winter seasons, mainly about keeping those calves warm. We can utilize their environment, jackets, things like that, obviously their nutritional intake, and also kind of follow them through and see what their needs change as those heifers will age, especially here over the winter months. So first of all, we always like to look at the maternity pen. So where that calf is being born is obviously critical. The next picture actually shows you what we would like to see, a nice deep dry bedding there that those calves are being born into. But especially here as the months are going to get colder, where those heifers and cows are going to freshen is going to be extremely important of what kind of environment that calf is born into. So we want to make sure it's nice, dry, warm bedding for them.
So very similar to humans, whenever we're outside and we get very wet, it feels very cold for us. That's the same with calves and heifers as well, correct?
Right. And especially with those newborn calves. So some maternity pens, depending on the weather, if we get a lot of rain, if we get some snow, that can quickly turn a maternity pen into kind of a sloppy mess. So here, obviously, we don't want these calves being born into any kind of these environments. We want to provide that nice dry bedding, but knowing that the seasonal changes can bring a lot of precipitation, we just want to keep ahead of that bedding and just make sure that these type of situations don't occur, especially in the winter, but any time of the year. So when we do take those calves out of the maternity pens, a lot of farmers will utilize individual housing in hutches. And you can see as the snow falls, obviously it's going to make that bedding in those pens wet as well. So we like to utilize calf jackets. That's a good resource to use in winter months. We kind of have to recognize, though, that they will get wet. They'll get wet in the rain and the snow. So if we have to take those jackets off to dry them, put a new jacket on, we need to do that as well. You can see the calf on the right. She does have a jacket on. However, her bedding is wet. So this, while the jacket is providing some prevention, she's laying on a wet surface, which is kind of going to negate the purpose of that jacket that she has on. So you want to know that those two go hand in hand. So while she does have that jacket on, her bedding should also be a little deeper and drier for her. Some things that some farmers have done in the area that are really neat. You can see the hutch on the left. That farmer is prepared for snowstorms. He's kind of crafted a little a door, if you will, to put in front of his hutches when they're expecting any kind of blizzards or snowstorms. To keep that blowing snow out of there. He's just trying to stay ahead of that bedding and keep that bedding as dry as he can. Obviously, they would be removed, after that storm. And the picture on the right is actually of a Franklin County dairy who orients his hutches as the winter months are approaching, he'll orient them to where the sun is actually shining into those hutches a little bit more, just taking advantage of that sunlight to warm those calves.
Yeah, and typically that would be the southern facing areas that have the most sunshine. I know, once we get in the summertime, you can even have sun in the northern part of a house, but in the wintertime, it's definitely focused on the southern facing areas. Northern facing parts of a building are in total shade as you go throughout the entire winter months.
And that's why it's favorable for a lot of producers to still use the hutches. We can pick them up, we can move them, we can orient them different ways to take advantage of those, cooling winds in the summer and the warming sun in the winter. We do have to remember, though, that when using indoor housing, this is not a chance to warm your calves up. You have to remember that if calves are housed indoors, that there should never be more than a 5-degree difference from the temperature outside versus inside, or you can tell you have a ventilation problem. So really, jackets are still a good idea for indoor housing. The little calf there on the lower left, she was sick. She was in this indoor facility and they weren't utilizing jackets, and she was kind of cold and shivering. So even if you have your calves indoors, jackets are still beneficial, especially for those young calves that get sick. We still want to provide some fresh air into those areas. So while we don't want to close it up tight, that's more for the benefit of keeping things dry, keeping our employees happy, but we want to recognize that, ventilation problems can still exist in these facilities, and calf respiratory problems can happen quickly if we don't manage them correctly. You can see the farm on the right there. This is a indoor shelter. In addition to the jackets, they actually have a heat lamp that's over their nipple bar, so they're providing lots of comfort to those calves. And as calves begin to age, obviously their rumens develop and they're able to produce more body heat, which then the jackets aren't so critical because that calf then can actually produce body heat a lot better than that newborn calf. So you'll see those shelters looking a lot different, but we do still want to provide them a place to get out of the snow. Chad's going to tell us how much snow we can look for this year, but just remember, we need a nice dry bedding source and shelter to get out of those storms that we anticipate. These are actually the same group of calves a couple months apart. They actually have an indoor housing as well. You can see they're utilizing the calf jackets, and then obviously we take them off once they reach an age that they can handle the cold a little bit more. We like to say about 3 to 4 weeks of age, if they're doing well, you can take them off. We want to remember that if there are any kind of swings in temperature, whereas you have a really warm day, we want to get those jackets off because those calves can actually sweat under there. And then once the temperatures dip down again at night, those calves will now be wet under those jackets, which will really negate the point of that jacket.
Yeah, and I do anticipate some temperature swings in the first part of January across the region. So we can expect some very warm days contrasted with some chilly days. That'll be one of the transition periods, I think, during our winter. So folks should keep that in mind, the early to perhaps the middle part of January for those temperature swings.
Again, a lot of these age of heifers are kept out on lots, even in the winter months. So one big thing I just wanted to mention here was the hair coat of your animals. So if you're putting them on an area where they're going to be getting muddy, where they're going to have a lot of manure caked to their hair coats, then obviously that's going to prevent them from being able to stay warm as well. We want a heifer with a nice clean hair coat that's down on the left. These ones on the right are severely matted with some manure and some mud. So that's really what we don't want to see, especially if you are housing them outside, because again, that matted hair coat can kind of negate the effects of their own hair coat, and then they're not able to stay as warm.
And we've been talking about temperatures and how that impacts them. In terms of the temperature trends in Pennsylvania for the month of December, what we typically see is the coldest period right before Christmas, around December 20th. And then towards the end of the month, we also have some colder temperatures. It makes sense as you go through December, as you lose sunlight for most of the month, you get deeper into the season, that you have your coldest temperatures in the second half of December. Now, the upcoming December, I do anticipate to be a lot colder than last year, but closer to average. So I think that this particular temperature curve that we see here with some colder readings where you definitely want to protect the calves and heifers will be in the middle to the end of December. So we will definitely slide into winter in December here across the mid-Atlantic. Once we get into January, there's the climatological data definitely favors January 15th through the 25th is the coldest period of the winter in itself. And the early part of the winter, or January, around the 5th, there tends to be a cold outbreak, and then the bottom falls out during the 15th to the 25th of January. I actually think that we'll have some milder temperatures here right around the first part of January. So that's where we'll have these temperature swings to make note of. And then the coldest part of the winter time does look like it will fall in line with climatology for the 15th to the 25th of January. And then going into February, Casey, I think the temperature curve here shows that we have most of our cold days in the first 10 days, and then you tend to have some fluctuations between the 10th and 15th before it starts to warm up a bit. And I do expect there to be a bit of consistency in our temperatures in terms of being cold for the first half of February, and then a little bit of a transition to some milder weather at the end of February. And then going through March is typically the first 10 days of March. You have some colder readings, and then a spike here of some cooler readings around the 20th. And this should follow suit with what's actually going to transpire during the month of March for the area. So the coldest part being the first 10 days or so. Now, when we look and take a look closer at switching gears a little bit to soil moisture anomalies here in Pennsylvania, it's been very dry across eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but the rest of the state, the soil moisture is actually doing pretty well. A little bit of a surplus in central Pennsylvania, and then dry up towards Lake Erie. The rainfall departures, this is since June, so this is looking back on the summer, and we had anticipated that the eastern part of the state would probably see a surplus of rain. That actually did not transpire. Instead, it was the central part of the state that actually had a good bit of rain, wetter than average. And now I want to turn my attention to Carly here, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how crops fared during this past summer in terms of crop yields and how the weather might have impacted crop production.
Sure. So the short answer to that is that it really depended on the crop, but a couple of examples where we saw that it was not such a good year for crop production, particularly in the areas where it was dry, were for corn. So I typically cover more vegetable and fruit production, but
right.
Our colleagues that are covering more of the agronomic crop production are really seeing reduced corn yields across much of the state, but especially in those driest areas, and especially for corn that's being harvested for silage. One of the growers I work with yesterday was telling me his yields are about a third to half of reduction from what he would normally see. So it's only about 2/3 to half of what he would normally get for silage harvest to feed his beef cattle is what he's harvesting that for. So he's pretty disappointed with those. But then in some of our vegetable crops, we saw that it turned out to be a pretty decent year, partially because we see so much yield loss due to diseases. So having it be a little bit drier kept some of those diseases at lower levels, which allowed the crops to do better without needing such intensive fungicide management in order to keep diseases in check. So especially for things like tomatoes and pumpkins, we saw that reduction in disease really made a big difference for those growers. So it depended on the crop. From the fruit world, I've been hearing that apples did pretty well, but peaches didn't have the best year because they didn't get enough rain during the fruit filling phases in July. So it really depended on what crops you were growing, whether it was a good year or a bad year for you.
Okay, yeah, that makes complete sense. It was a little bit dry in the onset of the summer, and then we picked up more rain. So the distribution of the rain really makes a difference in the crop yields and the type of crop as well, like you were saying with the corn crop. And go ahead and walk through for us some practices for post-harvest, what frost damage could potentially do, as well as soil health. So I'll let you take over.
Sure. So a couple topics I'm going to touch on here, because for for many of our vegetable growers, winter is really the off season. So unlike Casey's topic where we're talking about what to do during the winter, here it's sort of, what should we be doing to prepare for winter when we're not necessarily actively growing things in the field for the most part. So one of the topics I wanted to talk about a little bit is protecting our soil health over the course of winter. And so this is something of interest here in Pennsylvania, as much of our farmland is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And it's particularly crucial to protect it during summer because we don't typically have a crop growing in the soil to keep that soil in place. And so we see a lot of loss in soil over winter from snow that's then melting and causing runoff, or rain precipitation that we get in the winter. If that soil has been plowed up and it's bare, that's an area where we can lose soil, which is not good. So cover crops are a strategy we often recommend for helping keep that soil in place. And so if you are going to use winter cover crops, you will want to have sort of already gotten them in the ground or be getting them in the ground sort of leading up into mid-October in the southeast part of the state. For the northern part of the state, a little earlier would be better. And there's a number of different species you can choose from depending on what your goals are. If you're trying to shade out weeds in the spring as you're getting ready to take off these cover crops, if you're looking to use them for forage for livestock, or if you're trying to add some nutrients back into the soil, there's a lot of different options to choose from. But this is something that can really help keep your soil in place and protected and healthy over the winter when you're not growing a cash crop in that soil.
And I'll talk a little bit about precipitation, how that could impact the soil going forward. So I'll talk a little bit about the precipitation anomalies expected this winter here in a couple minutes.
Another thing to be thinking about is sort of sanitation practices post-harvest. So as we're sort of wrapping up this harvest season, I know we sometimes have the myth of thinking that, oh, if it's a really cold winter, we might not have as many pests or diseases the following year because they'll die during winter. And there's certainly a few examples where that's true, but it's not nearly as likely as I think many of us would like to think. So you should really be sort of thinking about what you have to do before winter with any sort of disease you had in the field, of making sure that any plant residue that had a disease in it is taken out of the field, and that sort of any other sort of sanitation you have to do in that field to clean it up for next year is done, because winter, no matter how cold it is probably not going to take care of the problem for you. So you still have to take care of it yourself. And then the last thing to touch on, and this is more relevant to our fruit growers than our vegetable growers, because we have very few vegetables that are perennial. The one exception is something like garlic that we plant in the fall and then are harvesting in the spring. But fruit is really the one area where we are keeping something in the field multiple years. And so this left photo is showing some black raspberries. The right photo is a strawberry field. There's a couple things you can do to keep these crops happy over the course of the winter, since they are going to be exposed to winter temperatures. So if you have brambles, raspberries, blackberries, other crops of that nature that need pruning, winter is not the time to do it because it's a stressful time for these crops. So know that you're going to potentially have some frost damage on those branches and canes, and so spring would be the time to wait and prune those. Once you see how much dieback you have from frost, then you can cut that damaged part off and have everything else left. If you cut too much off in the fall, then you're potentially going to deal with much more frost damage. So that would not necessarily be the way to go. For strawberries, so these are definitely prone to frost damage. And so the practice we typically recommend for these is once winter temperatures are starting to set in, so typically December for this area, as the plants are entering dormancy, come through and put on a relatively thick layer of straw mulch to keep them insulated from winter temperatures. And this will help keep those plants alive throughout the winter period of time. And then once it starts to warm up in the spring and the plants are just starting to grow, you can take this mulch back off to give them that sun exposure and let them start to grow the following year. So straw mulch is a great option for protecting strawberries from frost damage, and not over pruning brambles in the cooler months is key for protecting them.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, thank you very much, Carly. That was great information, as well as Casey Yost. Now I'm going to talk about the winter outlook and how it applies to both of the areas that both of you have expertise with. And the average annual snowfall in Pennsylvania is highest across northwestern Pennsylvania and here across the Laurel Highlands, where it's 100 to 150 inches per year. The Chambersburg area, south central Pennsylvania, averages 31 inches, a little bit less as you head towards Philadelphia, 22 and a half. And then north of the Turnpike, it's generally 36 to 45 inches, and then 41 inches out towards western parts of Pennsylvania. So our forecast going forward, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first date for the inch of snow. This is just average. Basically, between December 25th and December 31st is when most of south central Pennsylvania averages the first inch of snow. And I think that's going to happen this year. Unlike last year where we had a snow drought in the month of December, I think we'll follow climatology for the month of December. And I do anticipate there could be a white Christmas. There will be a white Christmas in some part of Pennsylvania, most likely the western part of Pennsylvania. But we will definitely follow climatology with the month of, or at least the first inch of snowfall this year compared to last year. The average late date or last date for 1 inch of snow in south central Pennsylvania, you can see here it's generally about the middle of March that we have the last inch of snow. And actually, this coming winter, I think the last inch of snow is going to be slightly earlier because I think the seasonal shift this year will be towards the earlier part of winter. And then we break out of winter a little bit earlier this coming season. So I anticipate that this trend will shift a little bit farther towards the beginning of March rather than the middle or end of March for the last inch of snowfall. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on this winter that's going to cause the pattern to be what it is. We're in a third consecutive La Nina. This is showing the depth of the water along the equatorial Pacific that's below average. It's a pretty large depth, and it's remained pretty consistent. As a matter of fact, if you looked last year at October, it's very similar to what it is now, maybe a little bit less. But this is just an example of how the triple dip, meaning we were in a La Nina 2 winters ago, last winter, and then expected again this winter. And this is what you can see down here on the lower left. This is the ONI index or oceanic index, basically a calculation of the sea surface temperature anomalies along the equatorial Pacific. And last 2 winters have been -1. 2023 will be very similar to that. So a third year La Nina for Pennsylvania and the United States. Here's how it shakes out with precipitation anomalies with a third La Nina winter. Now, they're very rare, actually, to have a triple dip. There's only a couple of analogs here. It does favor precipitation to be slightly lower than normal across Pennsylvania, but a better signal for dryness across California that has been in a drought several years now, and also across the Southeast, which is obviously reeling from the effects of Hurricane Ian with a lot of rain. For those of you watching this podcast or in the early part of October, that is, the impacts of Ian are still being felt. As for temperatures, most of the upper Mississippi Valley into the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic has below average temperatures when compared to the latest 30-year average with triple dip La Ninas. Now, last winter, this is how the snowfall amounts shaped out. This is the 6-inch snowfall amounts across Pennsylvania that was confined to the middle of January to the middle of February. And most of that was the eastern part of the state, had coverage of snowfall on the ground, snowpack of 6 inches. So when we look at our analog years for triple dip La Ninas, we notice that tends to be a little bit of a shift earlier, at least for the 2000-2001 season, to have perhaps 6 inches of snow in the ground by the time you get to the 1st of January. The month of January seems to be the climatologically favored month for snowfall. But then we have another stripe here in the early to mid part of March. Most of February has less than 6 inches of snow in the ground. That's with one particular analog. This is the 1975 to 76 analog winter that shows pretty much an average winter across Pennsylvania. You get a little bit of snow towards the end of December, and then you get a stripe of 6-inch accumulation from the middle of January into the middle of February. which is the crust, or the crux, I should say, of your winter. The 1917 to 18 winter, which was a surplus of snow. As you can see, areal coverage of 6 inches of snow was 75 to 100%. Most of December, so December was a pretty snowy month, backed off in the early part of January, and then it picked up in the middle of January into the first part of February. And then there was a late season snow in the middle of April. 1910 to 1911 winter saw a seasonal shift towards earlier part of winter, seeing 6 inches of snow on the ground in December, backed off, and then finally it came back in the early part of March. And one winter, I'm going to go back here just 2 slides, or maybe 3, I guess it is, to the 2001 winter, because I think that the best matched triple dip La Nina is going to reflect the 2000-2001 winter, where we had some snow in the ground at the end of December that carried in through the middle of January. And then we had another round here late January into February, and early March we had a little bit of snow. I think that this season will shape up. That's the best matched analog year for the upcoming winter 2022-2023. When we look at temperatures and precipitation, I want to look at analog winters. This is based on current sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic and the Pacific. There's a big area of warm water in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, and I think that's going to have an impact on winter storms this winter. And looking at those precipitation anomalies from the best matched years for that pocket of warm water in the North Pacific and North Atlantic shows that precipitation, this is snow, sleet, freezing rain, everything melted down to the liquid equivalent, water equivalent, average in Pennsylvania, but below average for temperatures. So there's another signal here for below average temperatures with the sea surface temperature pattern anomaly, not just with the equatorial Pacific, but with the North Atlantic and North Pacific. So now we're getting a pretty good signal here for a cooler than average winter. The Indian Dipole, back in the winter of 2000, it was just a couple years ago, 2019-2020 winter, very strong positive Indian Dipole, one of the strongest positive on record going into the winter season. That severely impacted our winter. We had very little in the way of snow because we had a strong Pacific flow. So instead of the storm track coming from Canada, it came across the Pacific, and we got very little in the way of cold weather. Well, this year, just like last year, there's going to be a negative phase of the Indian Dipole. As you can see here, we're in a negative phase now in October, if you're watching this podcast in October, and we're going to transition to a positive phase later in the winter. But with this negative phase of the IOD, we will have some colder air intrusions. Pacific storm tracks are not going to be dominant this winter. And when I look at past analog negative IODs, the Indian Dipole and La Nina winters, so we combine the two indices, snowfall for southern Franklin County is about 27 inches, which is near average for snowfall. And then when we look at the final spring freeze of the season, because of the earlier seasonality of this winter that I anticipate, this is the median date of the last spring freeze, which would impact when, for agricultural interests, when you start to plant in the springtime, May 1st across the Laurel Highlands to the middle part of April across south central Pennsylvania. Northern Pennsylvania is usually a little bit later in April. Now, this coming season, once we get out of winter, I think we're going to get out of winter early. So I think that the last spring freeze is going to be about a week before these dates. So very early April for Franklin County. Middle of April, once you head north towards the Turnpike, the Laurel Highlands will be the early part of May, as well as the northern part of Pennsylvania, and late April once you head towards the Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. So the bottom line is how I see the winter forecast. Last year, there was a void of snow in central Pennsylvania because the storm track was primarily east of the mountains. Atlantic City had one of its snowiest winters on record, and whereas there was a void across the I-81 corridor. the storm track this year will favor a couple of interior snowstorms, which is important for farmers and agriculture interests when it comes to the calves and heifers having to put the snow gate up during the winter storms. There's going to be at least 2 or 3 storms that produced 5 or 6 inches of snow, and the timing of that would be mostly in January, mid-January to the mid part of February for those winter storms. Temperatures will trend slightly colder than last winter, so that's very important to keep the calves and heifers warm this winter. And the coldest part of the winter is going to be in January and February, early part of February. We get a running start in December. A January thaw, that's where we have those extremes in temperatures, which will be very important to the calves and heifers. We will, during those extremes in temperatures, we'll also have a good bit of wind, and wind can also cause some soil erosion. And overall winter moisture content will be near average. So going through the winter, we should have near average precipitation with an earlier spring freeze happening earlier than average and earlier than last year. So with that in mind, I will see if any of you have any questions for me as it relates to the winter forecast. So go ahead and shoot away.
I think you pretty much covered the predictions, and knowing that it's going to start to get cold here in December and kind of hold on for a while, that's when you really need to think about like the bedding for your animals. Some of the farmers like to use the rule of thumb: if the ground's frozen, then the calves need their jackets on. So as you alluded to, that's going to happen here in December, and sound like it's going to hang on for quite a while.
Yeah, another factor, I didn't put too much emphasis on it in the winter outlook, but the stratospheric polar vortex, which can influence the weather, going through a bit of a dip here in early October, but it should recover once we get into the later part of October. I think actually that is going to play a little bit of a factor into the weather. There's some indications of a weaker stratospheric polar vortex in December, in a positive phase of the Pacific North America oscillation and a negative phase of the NAO, which when you combine those factors also supports the onset of winter being in December this year compared to last year when it was very warm. So we will start to see those, I think, colder temperatures in December. So that it'll be important for farmers and for calves and heifers to be warm, and knowing that going into the winter season that we're not going to have a start to the season like we did last year is very important, I think, with respect to temperatures.
I'll certainly be keeping that in mind for straw applications for strawberry growers too, that it might need to be a bit earlier than last year. Right,
exactly. Yeah, strawberry is one of the first seasonal items that folks go picking in June. So, and it's a very short time span in June where strawberry picking occurs before we transition out of the strawberry season for sure. So, I don't see an upside risk to a late season freeze or frost in the middle of May. I think that we will transition to a warm pattern in May with no potential for frost or freeze that could strike at the last minute before we get into summertime. So I know that can cause some crop damage as well, and I don't see any upside risk to that potential. Well, thank you so much for joining us again for the winter outlook and providing a lot of insight into your areas of expertise. I think that that's very informative, and folks will get a lot of information from this. And also, thank you very much for your contributions to the Almanac. Folks can get a copy of the 2023 Almanac by ordering online on our website. There's various stores across the Mid-Atlantic that also sell it, but there's a lot of valuable information in there as well. So thank you so much. And I guess happy winter to both of you. We'll definitely see you back here as we look at the summer outlook going forward through June, July, August, and probably even covering September as well.
Thank you.